All right, what's up, what's up, what's up? I'm not sure what's going on here. My controls are all over the place. If y'all are watching today, my my switchboard, my Stream Deck is giving me a hard time. So just a heads up, if we have any problems with that, that's what's going on. But we're gonna have a great conversation today. We've got a squad with us today. We've got Mason in the background. We've got Alessia in the background. We've got Colleen back here. We've got Search Historian. We've got Harshit. I think we've got Corey Moen who's going to join us here in just a second. And we're going to have a conversation about what it takes to build in Webflow, right? The perfect Webflow build. We've got notes here. We're going to go all up inside of the different things you need to know about building with structure inside of Webflow. So there's a lot of complexity that you have to think about inside of Webflow. You need to kind of understand the basics of how CSS and global positioning work and HTML and some of the things that, you know, like you may not have to think about in a lot of other platforms that you use to build on the web. And so we're going to dive deep into those nuances. We're going to start with a little bit of conversation about just like what are global classes, what are some of these things you have to think about, and then we're going to go deep into the different frameworks and talk about the nuances of each of them. So let's just go around the horn here. Actually, let's take a quick second and look at, we always do this, what's coming up in the community. So before we go to everyone real quick here, let's just take a look at what's going on in the community. So we've got this conversation coming up right now, Figma Little Big Updates, hosted by, I'm not sure what that one is, Colleen. What's that one? Right on. So simultaneous. Don't go watch that. You stay here until this is over. Then you can go watch that. Okay, friend back. That's right. Come back and leave it in the comments. Sound off. Let us know where you're watching from. We'll put those up on the screen here in a second. Add search and filters to your Webflow site, hosted by Webflow. We got the Friend Back Cafe that's happening later this afternoon. Creative South coming up at the end of the week. Just a bunch of stuff. Go check out stateofflow.io for all of the upcoming events for the week. This Webflow Nigeria Twitter space coming up on Thursday. The Lodge meetup, that's the No Code North folks. I'm trying to see if there's anything here that's super exciting that we should bring up. Now let's just jump right into it. I think we got a big crowd here waiting for this conversation. We got a bunch of folks kind of queued up in the background. Let's take it around the horn actually and let everyone say hi here. If you're watching, let us know where you're watching from. Give us a shout out. We're going to start here with Alessia. And yeah, just say hi to the crowd. This is your first time on a State of Flow stream. And just say hey and tell us what you're all about.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's so good to be here. It's actually not only my first stream, but like ever. So I'm super excited about this one. And yeah, I'm the co-founder of Code and Wonder and super excited to get this going.
Nice. We're going to go to Harshit next.
Hello everyone, this is Harshit. I work at Finsweet, and I'm really excited to be in this stream right here because I have been trying to figure out how to make a perfect website from a long time. I have been working. I have also worked on client first, contributed to some of its things. So it's actually really fun conversation for me, and I'm very excited to share tips and tricks and what it takes to make a perfect website for you.
Yeah, and Harshit is a G. Harshit, we were actually involved in the creation of the client first stuff. I'm sure I know it's evolved quite a bit from there. But Harshit is a superstar developer, and it'll be good to have your feedback on just kind of how you structure some of those builds. So let's see who else we got. Mason, what's going on?
Hey, good to be here. So my name is Mason with Edgar Allan. And yeah, really curious about this idea of a perfect website. We haven't done it yet. And I'd love to just learn from everyone to see how people are approaching it and kind of what we can do with inside of Webflow.
Yeah, and Corey, I'm gonna bring you up here, and you gave a little caveat about the perfect side of things. So maybe you can share that there's no such thing as a perfect build as you introduce yourself here.
What's up, y'all? Yeah, Corey. I'm a brand designer at Webflow, still freelance and things on the side as well. Yeah, and my comment was there is no such thing as a perfect build because, you know, you can build a billion different ways on the web, and that's the beauty of it. So I think it's more about the strategy and, you know, how you can go about it for the most amount of use cases in the most scalable, maintainable way. But yeah, stoked to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And we've got the crowd with us too. So let's jump through and see. We've got a bunch of people in the comments today. So let's just say hi to folks. We got Brandon Tancott in the house. Hello. Bulls, Edgar Allan, of course. Let's see. Colleen. Ben Selinsky is here. Lizzie is here. What's up? Aida. Hey, Aida. I haven't seen you in a while. What's up? Fernando Comet. Hello, hello. Brandon Herbal's in the house. Shane, what's up? What's up? Alexandria, hello. Let's see who else is here. Oh, Design Gal, Christine. That's Christine. Hello, Isabel. Man, you guys just had the Flow London event too. I'm so jealous. I saw the pics of the Flow London event. So shout out to everybody who participated in that. Jose Arce is in the house. Corey Flowman. What's up, Flowman? I see Kat Lim is here. Jake Spirik. Man, we got the squad. Maggie in the house too. All right, so just keep shouting off. Let us know where you're watching from. We always like to acknowledge the crowd. If you have any questions for the crew here, feel free to jump in and leave those in the comments as well. The link also to join. So you see we've got Aiva up here. Aiva, you want to say hi? Aiva's like the State of Flow. You know, he's like he's just our meme extraordinaire guy. He's back there always just hanging out. Do you want to say hi to the crowd?
Hey guys, everybody, excited to chat about perfect websites. And I think perfect websites are never done. So I wonder where this is gonna go. I love it already.
Yeah, and we had a Twitter space, but again, I'm having the live stream curses are in full effect today. So if anything else goes wrong, just chalk it up to whatever. But you can jump in the YouTube description. You can jump in the conversation. So if at any point during this conversation something strikes you and you're like, they got it all wrong, or hey, they totally missed this, or I think Reimar is a total idiot because, and you want to jump in and share those thoughts, I'm happy to hear that. We may agree or disagree with you. If that's the premise, we're probably going to agree with you. If you make some other point, we may disagree with you. So anyway, we're going to jump into this. Let's talk a little bit about the complexity of Webflow, because Webflow is a one-to-one abstraction on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So here we're going to get into it. Most other web builders kind of abstract away those complexities, so you don't have to learn anything about the box model, CSS positioning. You don't have to understand HTML structure or even what a div is, right? I didn't learn what a div was until I started playing in Webflow, and I started dropping these little elements onto the page, and I'm like, oh, container first. And it's like, no, don't ever use the container. Just use divs, right? And so I think as you start in your Webflow journey, I remember beating my head against the designer for 6 months because I didn't know anything about CSS positioning or the box model or any of these things that you need to know. And so let's start the conversation there. Does anybody have just a good intro point, a good warm up for what the box model is? I've got some resources on screen that we can come up to, but maybe somebody here from the panel has just a good intro that they want to kick this off with.
I think at one point I saw a meme, or go ahead.
Yeah, I think I would like to talk about complexity of Webflow. And, I have seen conversations about it is hard. It is someone says that it is very simple to learn, and then other people are fighting over it. No, it's not simple. It's hard to understand. I think I have my own understanding about Webflow after using it for a long amount of time. I think the concepts and the whole designer, the elements inside, like the flex box, the display properties, the positioning properties, and all those things, I think it is easier to understand those concepts. It's very easy to understand those concepts because of how Webflow have beautifully made it. We have Webflow University where they explain everything so beautifully, so easily, right? So I think concepts are very easy to understand, but it takes times. It's like doing 100 easy things one by one. So definitely you are doing easy things, so it's easy to understand, but you are doing at the same time 100 easy things. So it's going to take some amount of time, maybe a few months, for you to grasp over it and then practice over and over again. Yeah. So this is actually my take on Remar on complexity of Webflow, doing 100 easy things, I would say, or simple to understand things.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
I don't know if I agree, but I hear that. Does anybody else have any thoughts? Because I agree with you that at a certain point, it becomes easier, just like fitness. If you on your first day at the gym, you're like, oh, fuck this. But 6 months in, you might be like, oh, look, this is easier, right? But that doesn't mean the person walking on their first day is like, oh, look, this is easy, even if you can do the reps. So I don't know, Corey or Mason or anybody else have just a counter?
Yeah, I'm happy to share a sentiment.
Yeah.
I think specifically on the box model, right? So and how it relates to Webflow. I think the thing that I've always been so drawn to about Webflow, and even broader the web, is that Webflow is just, you know, a visual way to play and build with HTML and CSS that Webflow did not invent, right? So we often like ignore the fact that like there is pure geniuses that at some point 30 years ago or more invented this concept of box model and CSS and how you can build at like quite large scale and complexity and diversity on the web with just these concepts. And so the fact that like Webflow embraces that, and then all of us and the community and people that are building tooling on top of it, like frameworks, can leverage those in specific ways within Webflow. Again, it's just leveraging the strategies from outside of the product itself within Webflow. And there are some limitations in that, you know, like Webflow does not have all the CSS selectors that are possible and things like that natively. But the fact that we can, you know, leverage the concept of the box model, which the way I always explain it to people I'm teaching Webflow is as it sounds, it's just boxes within boxes within boxes. Like you literally took a design in Figma or on a piece of paper and, you know, a website design or a page design and just started trying to draw boxes that contain one thing within another and their relationship to each other, you can start to kind of form this ideal of how everything can and should be structured. And the fact that that can then translate over to something like Webflow versus like many other tools in the web building space is like a powerful concept that we just like take for granted pretty often. So I don't know. That's my hot take on box model.
Yeah, and I, as you're talking, I have a video of Webflow explaining the box model in the background, which has been like the perfect. I'm actually just going to start it again so it loops again. Shout out Webflow video team and the Webflow University, because that's where, you know, like it's a great place to start if you're watching any of this. But Corey, I think that's like the first thing to think about is that everything is just a box, right? The box model kind of explains that it's a boxes inside of boxes inside of boxes, and then figuring out how to get like a box to the top right corner or to the middle or to the edge of something, how to round a corner on a box, how to like dissect a box, how to use a map, you know, like that's how you then start expanding how you design. And it's not necessarily as intuitive as it may be if you're coming from like a Figma or a Photoshop or, you know, some kind of visual tool. Alessia, do you want to jump in and maybe have some thoughts here about just box model, understanding kind of what's happening here and how people can get their hands around these concepts?
Yeah, I think Corey just got it. Basically, if you have a design and you start drawing boxes around every single component and how those are positioned within like a bigger box and then a bigger box until you reach to the full page. I think that kind of like sums it up. I think that the tricky part is when you have a bit more complex design and things don't necessarily fit within boxes, but they're like slightly positioned like to the top or to the middle or elsewhere on the page. And that's where all the different positionings come in and properties. So we can maybe discuss this later on. I don't know if it's too technical, but I think the positioning is maybe one thing that people struggle with the most. Generally, I actually learn HTML and CSS before finding Webflow. So when I jumped in, it kind of like, oh yeah, this makes sense to me. Everything on the left is HTML and everything on the right is CSS. So that was actually, that's not what I struggled with. It was more like the nuances that how Webflow made this property their own, which I struggled with the most. So I come from like the other side.
That's an interesting thing because I think a lot of people who come to Webflow don't have any of that background. And so maybe they're learning from a blank canvas, but some people definitely do have that background. So it's a totally different learning curve. I think that's some of the fun of Webflow. Jocon Studio here is saying Webflow is a bridge. Let me see if I can read it. Webflow is a bridge with two sides, beginning by the simple, fast build with components that we have now with no code to the unlimited possibilities of development. So it kind of spans this pretty broad spectrum, trying to like abstract the complexity of this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into a visual framework. Mason, any thoughts here about box model or just kind of the fundamentals of the web as it relates to just getting your footing in Webflow?
Yeah, I think the thing that we've talked a lot about is Webflow gets us so close with a lot of what is possible with CSS, but it's just far enough where it makes these types of systems really, I think, difficult to scale. And we've on it. We launched our first system right before the first no code conference, and I guess like whatever that was, like 2000, was it 18, 19? I don't really remember. And we're on actually version 5 now. But it's kind of, and I think like you can also start to like look at it in terms of like the debate that's happening within the programming world around like functional programming versus object-oriented programming. And it's it's really difficult to be able to try to strike that balance between kind of like if it's just a kind of naming system or if it's a full-on kind of like framework, and how to be able to balance those. And so I think a lot of the things that everyone in here is trying to do is almost wag the dog, like find the best worst option, or like of all the bad options, like what's the best way to be able to build. And again, like we love Webflow, like it's really, really powerful. It's just there's some things where it's just like I would love for there to be able to, so that you could go in, and if you had like a set of utility classes, being able to edit that utility class without having to go back in and delete all the way back to the core class. Yeah. So I think that's a lot of where these systems start to have challenges where we can go and look at Bootstrap or things along those lines, but a lot of those kind of work within inheritance and abstraction and things that are more difficult within Webflow.
Yeah, and maybe that's something we should spend just a second talking about, because we have it up here, CSS in the wild versus CSS and Webflow. They are kind of they're very similar. Understanding them obviously is important to knowing how they work inside of Webflow. But like you just said, Mason, it's not exactly the same. You can't do all the things. And like you mentioned, Corey, like not all the CSS selectors are available in Webflow. So there's maybe some things that you could do if you're writing code by hand than you can do inside of an interface. And I think that's always going to be the case, because the code is obviously, the full toolkit. It's like the alphabet of language. And, we're dealing with like a specific set of words that we can kind of use to write our terminology here. And so anybody thoughts on just like the differences, and maybe Alessia, I don't know if you have any thoughts, or Harshit, just about the differences between what you can do with CSS outside of Webflow, how you have to adapt it once you get inside of Webflow, and kind of the thought process behind making that transition.
I think with custom code, you can pretty much do anything in terms of CSS, because Webflow is based on classes, which means that you can target those classes with just like custom CSS that you can add in, even if it's not within the Webflow designer. So the limitation, I guess, is knowing what's possible. So knowing what's outside of what's available in the designer itself. But yeah, otherwise, in terms of limitations, I don't know if Harshit, if you have anything else.
Yeah, I think it's more about what natively Webflow supports, like the CSS selectors, and what we can do, what is possible. So in terms of possibility, definitely all the CSS selectors are possible in Webflow, right? I really like using the aspect ratio. Last year, Sergey also made a post about making it native to Webflow. It would be a great feature to have. So I really like using aspect ratio. I really like using those last child selector, nth child selectors. And one of the best thing that I think you will be able to do if you use custom CSS is turn your JavaScript interactions, those IX2 interactions, into a simple CSS interaction, which saves a lot of performance, which actually which makes your website perform really good. So when I first found out, I found this CSS reference on W3 School website, which was a gem mine for me. I can see a lot of CSS selectors, actually all of the CSS selectors, and I have been using them till then. So the good part is it's not in Webflow natively, but it is possible to do in Webflow. That is the good part.
Does this
Yeah.
create a problem down the road at some point? Because one of the things I worry about in Webflow generally is like the lack of, like there's not the lack of, but there's a bit of a technical naivety when it comes to a lot of Webflow users. And I think it's because it's the entry point to their web design career is a tool like Webflow, which even though it gives you access to the full HTML and CSS, in some regards, it does abstract away some of that other complexity. And some of the things that people knock a Webflow or even some of the other tools out there, web building tools, is that they're never going to be the full code. You have the dev, you have the code purists that are like, oh, it's not code, just go learn to code. Is this going to create a problem at some point where maybe you can't do certain things, or people don't learn to do certain things, or people are limited by Webflow? Like, are more people going to come? And because like you talked about, there's Bootstrap, there's all these different front end frameworks, right? There's different types of CSS frameworks for code just on the outside of the world. And now we're building like this whole new abstraction on that, and these new systems that we're going to talk about here, these knockouts, the client first, the mass type systems, which are kind of replicating systems that you might use outside of Webflow to structure these global classes and these styles. Does this create a rift that's insurmountable? Maybe this is where we get into the technical weeds of why you even need these types of frameworks. Does this create limitations for people down the road? Any just general thoughts, Corey or Mason, or really anybody on any of that? Corey, go ahead.
Yeah. I think the way that I've tried to think about it is like somewhat related to my first comment around just like considering all of the web outside of Webflow, because Webflow is so consistent in certain ways natively with HTML and CSS. And so like, yeah, as far as that going into the future, I think to me, it's all correlated, right? So like even Mast as an example, which to be like super transparent with y'all, took so long and building confidence to even publish it. Shout out to Max Lind, who is my partner in NocodeSupply and just jamming on all that. And I think one of the biggest things was just this concept of like leveraging Bootstrap, for example, that we referenced multiple times in the docs. And candidly, I used Bootstrap a ton before I ever discovered Webflow. And so I was already very familiar with that. And something that we were looking at, like in this observation of like other frameworks out there, Tailwind, etc., is that like it's interesting to see some like Bootstrap that have lived for 10 plus years and observe the ways they have iterated and changed and the ways they haven't, and try to draw some conclusions on those things as to what will maybe kind of stand the test of time, if you will, right? Like, to me, again, this all boils back to the fact that like I'm confident in Webflow because it respects HTML and CSS. And I don't think HTML and CSS is going anywhere anytime soon in browsers, right? Like, I don't think all of a sudden next year we're going to have JavaScript only browsers. Instead, actually, you've seen CSS. If you follow, certain people in the like developer community, Kevin Powell, those types on YouTube, for example, CSS has gotten a lot of incredible updates like now and stuff that's coming. And so I'm super excited about like also the concept of how these frameworks, if they're respecting those things, whether it be like the diversity of units that are available. If y'all saw, we just Webflow just released like DVH and DVW and some of those other units. Like if we embrace those in a flexible way, then that can naturally allow frameworks to scale into the future, in a way as new spec and things become available, right? Whether it's native in the designer or not, to Harshit's point, like you can really do anything you want as long as it's in custom code within an embed. Candidly, I hope we'll have more things native in the future, like all the 50 some selectors at some point would be incredible to have native. I have no idea if that will ever happen, but yeah, I think the more we can do natively, the better to even embrace frameworks like this. So,
yeah. Anyone else thoughts in that same spirit? Response to Corey? Anything else? I agree with you. I don't think this tech's going anywhere, right? That's why it's the fun of it. I think that's what creates the complexity here, though, is figuring out how to adapt this into the space. I remember and Harshit, maybe you want to jump in on the client first stuff, because client first is kind of an adoption to say, hey, we understand CSS works like that outside of CSS, but inside of Webflow, we kind of want this thing, because in a regular world, like a developer, like if you hand off a custom site to a client, they're never going to touch the code, right? Because they just can't. But in Webflow, they can, and they get excited about that. And so they want to start digging in. And that led to this idea of like, let's create a client-focused framework that allowed people to kind of build and hand off these builds that simplified some of the concepts. So Corey, it'll be interesting to talk about like maybe some of the difference in the utility classes versus how I think in client first, there's like this spacing model that has kind of padding classes and global padding. And, you know, maybe we could get into, I think those are some of the core differences between a lot of these frameworks, is that some of them are more structured like a Bootstrap or Tailwinds or something like that, where you have lots of utility classes. You can kind of combine these elements. And then some of them have been kind of adapted to work more specifically inside of Webflow, using kind of the caveats that Webflow imposes as linchpins or decision points to say, hey, when we have this, let's divert to X versus Y for whatever reason. So Harshit, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think talking about client first, Remar, again, when we were working on client first, you know, we always, whenever we are making a decision, we are adding a new feature, always we think from the client perspective here, what is going to be their reaction on it. And at the same time, you know, generally people confuse client first with that it's only client focused. Let me clear that out. You know, it's not only client focused. We call it client focused because we are really giving them priority here. But we also focus on, you know, if a developer is comfortable doing it, because you know, it is designed by the top developers working at Finsweet, right? A lot of people were working to design the system. They shared their personal practices. They shared how they scale a website. So definitely it's developer friendly as well. It's not just client friendly. At the same time, I think it is really important, you know, when choosing a framework to work, it is really important to consider a few things before choosing a framework. You know, I have seen some great framework, like I really like the Must as well. And I have seen people, you know, having conversation about choosing the right framework for them, choosing the right style system for them. So I think it is really important to first ask yourself a question: who is going to use the website after it is ready? Again, it also depends on your business model. So there is a possibility that after a site is done, you are the one, or you are the only one, or your team is the only are the only people who are going to use the website in future, right? So in that case, I think you can work with a really solid rules, and you have a solid system for everything. Like you can have a system for grids, you can have system for columns and rows. You know, you can have much more rules and set of guidelines for yourself. But with client first, it's not really about that. We with client first, we have focused on the management type, management side of the team for our clients, so that manager can also understand it. People from their team who is new to Webflow can also get a grasp of it in short amount of time. That's the whole goal. And I was actually really happy to see one of the live results. Actually, let me share it with you. So recently we had a client where there was a designer. They shared the design with us on Figma, and I was working on the development part. And the designer, actually, I was off for a few days. What the designer did, he actually saw the whole other pages on the home page and all other pages, and he built a whole page out of himself completely. He was new to Webflow. He built a home page. He built a product page. It was a product page. He built a complete page following the conventions and the rules that he saw on previous pages. So it was a kind of a really nice, I think, nice symbol for us, a nice sign for us that it is working. It is working, and we are in some way helping client to understand the systems. So I think this is what I would say about.
I want to bring up an interesting point, because Corey brings up, he says client first is great, but clients still break stuff, because they do.
Yeah,
you know,
that is never going to
clients,
going to stop.
Clients just be doing client things, you know.
That is
Anybody
not
have
going to happen.
anybody have
Yeah,
thoughts
I
on
would,
that? On just handing off the site, because you could do the most structured thing and then you give it to the
yep,
client and it's just whatever. So, they're going to do whatever they do.
Yeah.
yeah. So I'll speak to it.
Go ahead, Mason.
How's my how am I doing in kind of bandwidth?
Yeah, you're great.
Am I glitchy? Am I all right?
You're good.
Okay. Yeah. So I've seen this in different iterations, and I think absolutely trying to think about, like, the whole goal of no code is really around client authoring, and then thinking about like how to be able to set that up. The point of tension is, for the way that we've been thinking about things for a little while. And by the way, so it's like we launched Knockout last year. Knockout was kind of a reflection of what we'd been doing the year before, and we're about to launch Featherweight, which is our 6th version of how we've been working. And I can talk about just like how that progression has gone or whatever. But there's kind of this tension between like how many custom classes you're writing and how those are being formatted. So I think Client First does a great job of being able to kind of have a naming structure within that, and then how many utility classes. And for us, what we're trying to think about is like how to help teams build at scale. And we've seen challenges where if you start to have too many custom classes within the build, that it's going to start to slow down the page rendering, because the entire CSS file is being rendered on every single page, whether or not it's being used. So that right there starts to create performance hits. And especially if you start to get into like, multi-thousand pages, and thinking about, like, again, like most of those are going to be CMS driven, but then you're having, anywhere from close to 100, and then potentially even doing multi-instance builds. It can just start to, your performance is going to gradate over time, and how to make sure that, like, things are being abstracted in a way where people can understand it. But I think that, again, back to my first point, I think there's a lot, we're able to make just huge strides in how we're able to kind of set these builds up for clients. But like, no matter what, like, until there is like, and I think on the enterprise side, there's steps that are being taken with like limited designer. Limited designer is fantastic. I'm really hopeful for the future of components. And I really hope that, and I think that right now we're talking about classes. In a year, I would love to have this same type of conversation around what's the best way to set up a component structure, because I think that's where things start to get really powerful. Because no matter what, like, the classes are always going to be fragile. And then, we've had to rebuild our own sites that we've built. We've had to rebuild client first sites. And it is not the systems. It is like once these get handed over and then people start taking shortcuts.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's always the problem, is the scalability long term, because what happens in a pinch when you hand the thing off and then they don't have access to you, Mason, or you, Corey, or you, Harshit, or Alessia.
Yep.
And then next thing you know, it's Joe Schmo, who's the Webflow pro, and they're going to jump in and I got you, baby. And they just start naming all the files like they do a Photoshop layer or something like that. And you just have these things. And then maybe they mess with a global style and they kick out all sorts of other stuff, or maybe they start adding all sorts of combo classes, and there's just all these different things. And then when you go into that, you're just like, okay, well, do we try to digest what happened here, or do we rebuild? Which, again, that goes back to the complexity, I think, of some of these frameworks, because I remember when Hatch first came out, and I think Hatch was like one of the first kind of naming conventions that took off, and like Mackenzie Child came up with this like super utility class, but it had like thousands and thousands of classes, and it was so heavy. And it was almost like you had to learn a new language. So not only did you have to learn Webflow, but now you also had to learn like all these utility classes. And so there is this balance between like, what's the real complexity? What can we do? What's inevitably going to get screwed up down the road because we just have to adapt and kind of move things as we go? And then like, what can we try to have in some semblance of a system so that we can maybe bring in additional devs or share a project across an agency and have some level of consistency? Because that's really where these naming conventions come in. If it's just going to be you building, maybe it's not that big a deal, right? If nobody's ever going to see it, you can name the shit whatever you want. And, maybe it's not as performant, but nobody's going to care. It's when you have to hand that off, or when you have to work with somebody else, or when you want to go back into the build, a month later and remember what the heck you actually did. That's when these systems come into play. So Any thoughts there just about the balance between the complexity? Corey, you just launched Mast. So what were you thinking about, like, seeing all of the ones that came before? I bet you were working on some of these systems even when Hatch was public, right? So like, I mean, I'm sure this is just you know, like, what did you take from the existing frameworks? What did you create new? What were you thinking through when you went through that process?
Yeah, plus one. I mean, again, Mast is just the happenstance of publishing what I've been using for like 5 years, and also constantly evolving based on things, you know, I've built with like ShapeMaker, or even things that we've learned from the framework we've built kind of based on the Mast direction internally on the brand team at Webflow. And here's the way I could put it in, I think, as simple of terms as possible, is that like, I love making sense of the world through metaphors, right? And understanding things outside of the current context to make sense of the current context. And so two things always, for whatever reason, for me come to mind, because they're, I guess, things I do in my spare time. One is the very highest level of golf. If anybody's played the sport of golf, the whole point is to, you know, hit a small ball in as few strokes as possible into a hole at the end of a range, right, of a distance. And I think of CSS this way all the time, where like, I just want to get to the end layout and result with as few classes, styles, etc. as possible, because ultimately that's less to maintain. It's more performant negligibly, and you know, like, it's just a simpler thing to conceptualize as well. So like, that's the highest level. And then I think specifically with like Mast, and if you read through the docs, which, you know, are still kind of beta, Max and I writing things out as we've learned over the years, there's like some little hidden metaphor things in there, like some related specifically to woodworking, that I think about a lot. And so an example in the, like, you know, do I have all the tools or just some tools, is like, if I'm going to go build something with wood or really anything, you know, I'm going to go to the garage, I'm going to get, you know, a saw and maybe some glue and some screws, just the couple things I need to go build something, right? Versus like, I don't necessarily want to build it and have every single tool around me and then spend so much longer trying to find the right tool to pick up to grab. I just want the things I need for that moment. And then as I need something else, I'll go get it. This is totally also just a preference. Some people would prefer the, you know, like full racks of tools at all times and within a hand's reach, right? And so I think about frameworks and building on the web in the same exact way. And that's where Mast has always kind of evolved out of, is like, what is the limited amount of things I ever need? And then how can I have it structured in a way that I can easily add to it? So this is why like utility classes in Mast, there is, you know, only like a limited amount of margin bottom, top, padding, bottom, top, and zeroed out, etc., is because I've just never really felt the consistent need in all the sites I've built to do left, right, all the other sizes and ends. And when you think about it again in the spectrum of frameworks, and in contrast to things like Tailwind, which is like full utility. In fact, like, you know, if you dig around the web, there's some people that aren't a fan because there's parallels that can be made to like inline CSS and Tailwind, because, you know, like it's great for people building in React and frameworks like that, where they want kind of that CSS and JS concept. But for something like Webflow, where you're building with a bit more of the true nature of CSS and its intention, to me, it just felt like, you know, the full racks at hand reach of tools. I don't need all of that. I want to use classes in a very strategic way and only have what I need. And then as I need more, like the spacing utilities, if I need a right one for some reason that is going to fit the brand I'm building for, then I'll go add one in the style guide as my kind of living documentation, and then keep moving, right? And then I'd say the last thing I'd mention related to this concept is like, there's another note in the docs on this concept of like carve versus glue. And this was like, I think the one that Max and I think even internally, the brand team at Webflow and our boilerplate system have gone back and forth about the most, is like, essentially, do you normalize or zero out everything or not, right? Specifically like headings and paragraphs. A common approach is like, zero bottom margin on every single heading out the gate, and you can set what you want when you need it. Whereas in Mast, like the way that, again, just out of, I guess, experience or what I've felt has worked most efficiently and most flexibly, is that a word, flexibly? Most flexible across projects is this concept of like, I want a default M margin on all my headings. So anytime I add a heading and then typically a paragraph under it, spacing's already set and set globally. I don't have to worry and cognitively think about, okay, what was that size I've been using under each heading 2 or 3 or whatever, right? And then if I want to adjust that globally, I can. So the carve versus glue mentality is, again, woodworking. When you're cutting a hole or cutting a piece of wood, you know, there's a saying, measure twice, cut once. If you miscut, you can't just like, you know, glue on that little shaving again, like you're kind of screwed. So you need to make sure that you nail it right the first time. And I realize this is all, again, conceptual, metaphorical, but this is kind of, for me, the lens I've always seen frameworks through. And, you know, the less is more. How can I be as efficient with only the things I need as possible and scale from there? So hopefully that makes sense.
I think this is a really good point to keep in mind.
At some point, we're going to have like a.
Go ahead, Mason.
Oh.
Go ahead, Mason.
Oh, I was just going to say, Corey, at some point, we'll have to have like a metaphor off. Because, yeah, there's one, I use a lot of metaphors. I think I was giving some feedback to a product team recently, and they're just like, man, that's a lot of metaphors you're talking about. But it's like a knockout, you know, we talk about it's almost in like painting. And so, you know, John, who wrote a lot of the documentation, he had talked about kind of like, you know, moving from broad strokes to kind of refinement, and especially as it relates to viewports, because that's where the complication comes. I hear you on trying to have as few strokes as possible, kind of golf strokes. It's just, you know, what do you do at like, you know, extra large viewport and small viewport, and then how to be able to collaborate between teams. We actually have a little bit of CSS that we add in there when we're configuring to kind of normalize for extra large viewport, so that we can do that kind of once, and then, you know, we get to like basically, you know, above large viewport, and then it's just going to kind of grow mathematically. So it's, I think, trying to look at just like, one, what does that handoff look like? And then, you know, as you were saying, like, where do you go in and maybe make some optimizations, or have some things in which you're balancing between, again, those, you know, individual classes, and then moving into utility classes.
I think that's a little bit of the art here, isn't it? When you start even talking about, because even inside of these frameworks, it's so easy to over style a project. And maybe this is where we need to take a step back and talk about like global classes, and just kind of think about some of these things, because Corey, like you're saying, you can easily find yourself, and this is where the clients screw up, is they don't understand that it's a combo class, and then they add a style to that and they create a new thing, you know, that it's two utility classes. And then by them adding a style in that moment creates the combination class. Or like, it took me a long time to think about, like, I would go in and set the text color in a specific element, right? And so that would create a class rather than like setting it at a parent element that would then control that. And so when I went and started doing things like trying to make a dark mode, it was like chaos, because, you know, your font colors are now controlled in like 10 different places on the page, and you're just like, oh shit. So even inside of some of these frameworks and thinking about global styles and blah, blah, whatever, you have to like learn those efficiencies, like you said, about getting your strokes down, you know, because there is definitely you know, a middle ground. I want to read this comment from Matt, maker Matt Evans here. It says, unpopular opinion. The more semantically simple a class strategy is, the more risk there is of a client thinking that they can make updates. And so there is, again, I think, and this is going to be Webflow's problem from here into infinity, because they're trying to abstract complexity. And then again, going back into like, we're making it easy, but it's not really easy. It's just abstracted, right? Like the complexity is still there. And so there's this art between like simplifying things, trying to, you know, for lack of a better word, dumb things down. And then, you know, you create that like on-ramp, and then the world floods in thinking like, I can do this. And they build like spaghetti stuff. And this happened with code too, right? Long before there were CSS naming conventions, there was just CSS, right? Before Bootstrap and before Tailwinds and before all these other things that like organized just regular CSS, there was all sorts of crazy shit spaghetti code, I'm sure. That's why these frameworks came to be. And so now we're kind of going through like this iterative cycle where it's like CSS frameworks, Webflow frameworks, more CSS, more frameworks, more Webflow, more frameworks. And like, there's going to be these curves between like simplifying it, using it, and then kind of seeing the complexity but hiding parts of that. Any thoughts from the panel just on that dance?
I think a really quick thought would just be, I agree with your perspective, but I would also say that even when frameworks have been introduced, there's still just messy code everywhere, all over the web, right? Like even any of the frameworks we've all created, I don't think will ever, fully or even per the stream perfectly resolve those things. So like, I think the way that I prefer to think about it is more of like, how can we just create strategies to try to, embrace the mess and bring some sense to the chaos, and like in whatever you do, do it in a way that allows for as much efficiency as possible. Because like even to the whole like, should the client edit in the designer or not? It's like if you can do it really quickly, quicker than it would take for them to jump in and even find where to go in the first place because of your system, then like maybe it's all nets out anyways, right? So
yeah,
that's just really, really quick 2 cents.
Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I think a point is, like you said, there was like CSS and then these CSS frameworks, and then there's Webflow, and now there's Webflow frameworks. And I think I love anything that has structure. So I love all of these different frameworks. And when I first started coding, I use Bootstrap all the time. But there's the little difference that I find between just normal CSS and Webflow are the combo classes. Because you don't really have that notion in just CSS. Like you can add as many classes as you want, and you can remove any of the classes wherever they're positioned, and they're all kind of independent from each other. Like you don't have the global combo classes and then the utility class. Like the way that Webflow handles multiple classes, I think that's the biggest, like where the mistakes often happen, and where the client always like goes in and changes something, and all of a sudden it was like 2 global classes, and now they created a combo class. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. And kind of what I thought, okay, like how do you strike the balance between having the least amount of classes possible so that the site is efficient and loads quickly and all of that, but also avoiding any combo classes as much as possible. So any more than 3 is like a no for me.
And those are good rules,
So
I think. Maybe what we can do here is maybe we can go through and kind of bring up the 4 frameworks that we have at the table here, and just think through a little bit and just have some thoughts about just the general approach, the overview. I see someone asking here, so maybe we can start with Knockout. Paul Ratchford is saying, is Knockout designed specifically for, are the comments not showing up? Hello? Okay, perfect. Now we're going to lose the comments. Okay. Well, what he's saying is Knockout designed specifically for scale. Love the idea of fewer classes, fewer divs. So Mason, let's jump to you, and we'll just go round table here with the different frameworks that are kind of at the table here. We've done enough, I think, setting the groundwork for what these things are. I know you've probably mentioned a little bit about this, but talk about what was the core problem you were trying to solve here? Was it the agency handoff? Was it client functionality? What were you trying to accomplish here with Knockout, and kind of what was the approach as you guys got into building this?
Yeah, I think it was an experiment, one with like what we could do with a set of utility classes and how those could start to work with Webflow Enterprise. So it is not just for scale, but we do find that, if we can go in, one of the problems is like people creating new classes. And so if you can encourage people to reuse classes, then you're going to have a more successful build. Like they can only kind of mess up something at a page level as opposed to something globally. A feature that was rolled out that we were designing Knockout for is limited designer. So the idea in the limited designer, this is an enterprise feature where you can basically lock down the CSS for like a user within Webflow. So what that means is they can drag divs out, and then they can start applying, you can start dragging elements out, and then you can start applying classes on top of them edit the classes. And so within that, the idea was how to be able to have kind of a building blocks style where they could go in and make adjustments, be able to have kind of like a full authoring experience, but we wouldn't have to worry about, did they break something globally? Because if you break something globally and it's for, major site or whatever, like marketer might think that they've only impacted one page when in fact, like you've impacted all of those pages. And by the way, it's pretty much impossible to see what the impact of anything that you roll out is going to be without doing kind of end-to-end audit of the site or doing a manual export of the CSS and then doing a div between what's changed. So that was kind of the intent of how we were thinking about it. The other part is trying to have kind of like that collaboration between the teams. So just we have people working in multiple time zones. We'll have a build that starts in South Africa and then gets picked up in Atlanta, and how to make sure that like those teams know like, yep, working mostly from the style guide, configuring the style guide, and then kind of building with Legos from a class standpoint as those pages are coming together. And then I think the other thing that I just wanted to build on is something that Corey had mentioned was really just the importance of a strategy. So whether like it almost doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter, and there's lots of intent around like how each one of these systems has been put together. But the biggest thing is almost just trying to think about like the systems that drive behavior, which creates the value. Like that's something I go back to a whole lot of times. So if you're working at a systems level and you understand that this is the way in which we're going to be operating, that you can start to control that sort of downstream like behavior and value that you're delivering.
Yeah. And I think it's, that's interesting because I think you have different use cases or needs at Edgar Allan than maybe a small shop. And maybe that's something that as we go to the next framework, Alessia, we'll jump to you here. But there is a difference in complexity that comes with needing to have multiple people work in a project and to be able to hand these things off. This is stuff Webflow is just learning, right? The collaborative stuff. They're just kind of coming up with branching for enterprise level builds and things like that. And so I think Webflow started as like just a little landing page builder, one person building one little landing page. And now it's a platform where people are building huge websites for large enterprise operations and different types of use cases, which means that the way people work with Webflow, I think even internally, is sometimes, like not real clear. We're all kind of making this up as we go, and everyone's kind of learning and sharing. So, Alessia, what do you see when you were building your flow class here, in your overview here? Like, what was your approach? What was different for you to kind of think about this type of naming structure or naming system in Webflow?
I guess a lot of our builds are based on components. So first of all, thank you, Corey, for pushing me to share the flow class. I initially wrote this for like our internal team to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then I thought, oh, maybe I'll share it out, but I'm not too sure because it's always work in progress, but I guess everything is at this stage. And previously to this, like we used client first, and we tried like lots of different approaches, and everything is great, by the way. I think it's down to personal preference as well. I found that a lot of the time, especially with combo classes, it's quite difficult to explain to the client, or rather it's not difficult to explain, it's difficult for them to put an interest in this, so they want to learn how all the different combo classes and all the different structure works. So the way that we do a lot of the designs is based on components. So you have various components which are reused in different pages. So then the thought behind flow class is to name things based on where they are on the website. So it doesn't have to be page specific, or it doesn't have to be, it could be a global class within the component. So yeah, I'm not sure I'm making much sense here.
Yeah, of course you are. You're doing great.
So yeah, let's say you have a simple card, and this card, you could use it for your blog post, you could use it for your news or anything like that. So it's always the card. So you're always using the same kind of class. And then everything which sits inside of that card will start with the card name. So the first name is always the component, and then it goes into the specific of what the item actually is. And yeah, that could be used across the site. So I guess the main aim is to, when you read the class, you know where that class will be used across the whole site.
Yeah, I like this. I am going to read into this. I will tell you, I'm gonna be real honest for folks who are here. While we were doing the client first docs when I was at Finsweet, and even to this day, there's things I don't necessarily always agree for. I couldn't say this back then. I had to be all in, you know. But some of the spacing and some of the like nesting divs and some of the things like they weren't native to me. They didn't feel comfortable to how I work in Webflow. And I think that's part of this whole quest is you got to find things that work for other people and then look to figure out how do they suit your needs. Not a single one of these systems, unless you built it for yourself over 5 years, like Corey did with Math or Alessia has here as part of her process. Like it's just, there's give and takes, and you have to learn and you have to figure out how do you make this thing your own, and how do you like make it fit your needs. This has been a reoccurring theme in the last few episodes. It's like, what do you need for your specific use case? How do you apply it to max value? And how do you get the job done in an efficient way so that you can earn your income and move on to other things? And so I don't know, do folks have thoughts on that before we run on to the next one? Corey, I see you coming off mute there. No? Hello? Yep. Yes? No? Okay.
Well, one thing to add.
Go ahead.
If Corey,
Go ahead.
once Corey sorts out the mic, is that I guess we talked about frameworks, and I didn't necessarily see Flow Class as a framework because nothing is set in stone. It's more a way of thinking of how to structure your naming. So it's very open. Like you could name it whatever you want, but as long as you have that structure and it makes sense of where you're using those classes, then it works for me.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I liked how.
Go ahead, Colin.
I liked your card example,
Yeah.
Alessia. That was one of the things that resonated with me. As we've been talking about, like the different frameworks and what maybe the impact for clients, impact for how we think about things. I mean, we each think about things differently. There's also we haven't necessarily talked much about like the types of things that are being built. What maybe works for one type of site. I don't know. I mean, I'm not super versed in all the frameworks to necessarily know if we should also be taking into consideration, not just our team size and what our clients are doing, but the types of sites.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the sites that we usually work on is super custom. So that's hence like the custom naming becomes quite useful for those kind of sites, at least.
Yeah. Hey Mason, I'm sorry, I don't have your video in the shot, and I'm not sure the audience is getting your audio here. I'm not sure what happened, but you've yeah. Sorry, I think something happened and your call dropped, and I don't have your audio coming in. So either refresh or we're gonna have to Yep. All right. Sorry. Thanks. Okay. Let's go to, yeah, sorry, Mason. Yeah, they should be hearing. They just weren't hearing Mason. I just realized what was happening there as he was chatting because I wasn't seeing his audio come through. Okay, Corey, we're gonna go to you, and we'll give you some thoughts here about what you were thinking, what problem you were trying to solve. Obviously, this is just your work style, 5 years of work, kind of coming into the thing here. There's also a lot to be said about like there's so much more because then you have to think about responsiveness and like. I don't know. We can't get into everything that comes with it, but let's just go back to, what you were thinking about. What's your core, takeaway here? Obviously, simplicity. You talked a little bit about that. Is there anything else you'd like to leave folks with as just like a thought process as it relates to your framework and the process of setting up, a structured build?
Yeah. Y'all hear me now? Okay.
Yep.
I think I'm good.
Yeah,
Sweet.
You're good.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a perfect tee up. What I was going to say anyways, off of Alessia's comments is that like even since releasing Mass, we've had a few people like ask in this realm of like, how are you going to get people to adopt it and stuff? And like, literally our only goal is that not that people use Mass, it's that they think twice about there's options, right? Like sometimes, no matter what you're doing in Webflow, that I've observed in the community, it's like it's sometimes so easy to just jump in, see some of the most popular resources and tools in the community, and just go head first at it, build something. And then often, more times than not, we'll say, I've observed people fall and then, struggle to get back up because that kind of ramp into it was maybe a little too quick, right? Or not considered enough of, hey, there's like a methodical, strategic way you can go about this, and not one way, but many, 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 many ways. And so I think like I'm presenting about Mast at a Minneapolis meetup, Webflow meetup tonight. And at the end of my little deck, like the thing I leave everybody with is like, this is just a slice of the pie. And really, if you want to like embrace this strategic approach to like keep building anything and really scalable solutions in Webflow, learn and practice, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I have this big list of like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all these things. And that's not to say that it should be intimidating or whatever. The point is that it's empowering, and that when we've seen people in the community be most successful, it's because they've usually embraced that learning curve. And instead of, wanting to just have a quick solution that cuts corners to get there, they like go all in and embrace the fact that like the first few things they build aren't going to be perfect. And I love that, because that is probably when you're going to learn the most, and then be able to like really nerd out and dig in on all the details of why you should build in a way that makes sense to you, to Alessia's point, like, and Mason's point, right? Like a framework is definitely a personal preference, and also a preference that you feel will translate best to the people you pass work off to, whether that's on your team or clients. And so that's the takeaway, I think, for me, is just like explore, learn. This is just the beginning, and like that's the power and difference of using something like Webflow. If you really want to, cut corners, I will candidly recommend Squarespace and Framer all day to people. Like those are the DIY tools. If you want the pro level, like I want to sell tens of $1,000 websites and compete with WordPresses of the world, Webflow is it, and like, and the an example of that is the fact that we can do frameworks like this, and these strategic approaches to build at scale and performance, right? So
I think the Webflow's it, needs to be a meme. Colleen, that's gonna be a clip. Like Webflow's it,
I think that's the first clip I'm doing.
That's right.
Yeah. Y'all know I'm overly biased, so hopefully
we all are.
That's clear, because it's also not it. To be fair, there's so many options out there, but yes, I'm a fan.
Nice. All right, we're gonna kick it. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alessia.
Sorry, I wanted to add also, because I feel like a lot of people get into Webflow and then they kind of stay in the bubble of Webflow, but then go and have a look at everything else, because I mean the web is way bigger and there's so many resources out there which are not necessarily Webflow, but there are like CSS or like or JavaScript or anything else, which you might not find the solutions just in Webflow forums, but also in lots of different other forums which are not Webflow specific.
I think that's a really good point. And just in general, don't it's okay. So a lot of people that are coming into the web design world right now, and I've made this point in the past, they come in and they see a tool like Wix or Webflow or Squarespace or whatever in its current iteration, and they think they know a little something about web design, but they forget that this industry has been around for 20 plus years, right? Like I think in the late early 90s is really when the World Wide Web kind of kicked off, and ever since then. So what's that? That's 20, 30 plus years of web design and iterations and things that have happened. And so if you're just coming into this space and you're just like, think you're going to learn Webflow and you know something, like, okay, you know something about Webflow, but Webflow is an abstraction over a bigger thing called the internet. So going back to Alessia's point, the more you can learn about how the internet itself works, the more you can then come to appreciate about what Webflow does and how to kind of leverage it in meaningful ways. And I think that's the more excited you get about the potential of what's coming here, because you see like, oh, if I could just build these front ends for different things and then eventually plug them into other people's back ends, like we're off to the races. And I think that's where we're headed. Harshit, we're going to jump to you and client first. There's also some interesting questions coming in on the audience about client first. I know we're at our hour mark, so we're just over the hour mark. So if anybody has to go or drop off, totally understand. But we're going to just kind of go through the rest of the conversation here for whatever that lasts. So Harshit, tell us a little bit about the process. I can even, talk to some of this because I was there during some of this process, but the innovation here, and it continues to be even with things like folders and giving people new ways to think about managing classes in Webflow, is interesting to me, right? So there is a lot of innovation here. This is a big team using the system. Harshit, talk a little bit about what the goal for Client First is, beyond what we've already talked about, like obviously getting it in the client's hands, but in general, working as a big team, your use of it, et cetera. What say you?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the primary goal is, of course, to make a proper system for a development, right? To make a good website. There is not a definition for a perfect website, but we want to get as close as possible, right? So the ultimate goal is definitely the first thing is, we want to make it easy for the clients, for the developers, and then also follow certain processes to make your system scalable, to make your website scalable, and at the same time collaborative, right? Like we follow a system so that if let's say two developers are working on a same project, if there is a big project, I am on a leave, so someone other can take over and then they can continue the project. And this happens when working on the team. We have seen this. Sometimes Aditya jump in a product that I am working on, or maybe I am jumping on someone else's project, right? So these things get really easier when we are following a style system, right? And with client first, we do focus on that collaborative part as well, right? At the same time, I think, Remar, we call it a system because it does not only involve naming convention, but we have strategies for different things like spacing. We also included interaction naming strategy. I think it is also very important because all the things that you actually name inside Webflow, if there is going to be a system that you are going to follow, it's going to be easier for the client to understand. It's going to be easier to scale. It's going to be much more consistent. Like I really like to name my components with a proper structure. When I name components, I have maybe I'm using brackets, I'm using some lines to kind of divide this. A lot of people use emojis as well, right? So I think that is really nice. With client first, I think we all, I think you have the flexibility to make it your own. With the live streams as well, we are encouraging everyone to make it on your own system. In fact, everyone in the team, most of us have our own version of client first, right? We like to, whenever I start project, I like to make a few changes to the base system so that it fits my needs and how I like to work on a project. For example, I like to have heading space, heading bottom margin, so I generally add heading bottom margin to all of my headings, and then I use custom CSS last child property or only child property to kind of remove the spacing from the only heading if there is a condition where there is going to be only one heading without any paragraph. So I think the goal of the client first was definitely to create a system around the chaos, as Corey said, and make it easy to collaborate, share with the client, and how they can use the project as well.
Yeah. I think that's well said. I think I mean, client first was a big leap forward. I mean, we can see here 25 to 26,000 clones, you know, so there's like lots of frameworks out there, but I think from a, you know, and this is probably skewed because every time someone creates it, they go and reclone this. So I think that stacks it up on all of these frameworks, but there is a need and a desire for people to want to learn how to build structured in Webflow. Like once you basically figure out Webflow, like once you figure out the positioning and the box model and you get a little bit of kind of what's happening in the space, I think that's the first thing you start thinking about is, okay, how do I like use this now? Because you start seeing like div 387 and you're like, oh shit, that doesn't, like that probably shouldn't be there, you know? And I have a question. Do any of you guys like go back and refactor stuff? Do you always use your frameworks as you're doing like perfectly in real time? Or do you sometimes build and hacky some stuff together and then go back and refactor a few things and kind of clean some stuff up? Like how do you all work?
I personally try to, you know, I think it's inevitable. Sometimes you have to go back and make certain changes. I think in most cases, it's about the global versus custom classes thing. You know, how, for example, if you have a component that you are going to reuse, but you have not realized yet that, you know, this component is going to be reused after in some pages. So you named it something that is very exclusive to that particular page. And now after you are on the third page and now you realize, okay, I need the same component here. So instead of giving it a custom name exclusive to that page, I personally like to go back and rename the initial component so that I can reuse it. I think it is really important, like with client first and with other conventions and with other frameworks as well, we have power to have custom classes, right? It is really important for us to understand how we are naming it. Like, let me give you a quick example. So if I have a section, for example, I'm going to use it as an about section. There is a layout where I have an image and then I have a paragraph on the right side and a heading. I can name it about underscore section or about, I can create about a component out of it, right? It's perfectly legal. It's perfectly fine. You can do that with the client first framework in style system. But when you are naming it as about section, you are actually limiting that particular layout to the about section. You cannot use that layout in any other section, right? So what I will personally do, I will name it something like layout 1 component or layout layout 2 component if there are multiple certain structures. So now when you named it layout, see, only naming certain things change the whole thing. Now you can actually reuse that component on multiple pages. So I think naming something is really important, whichever framework you are using. How you name structure is also going to define how scalable your website is going to be.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah.
I do exactly the same. So while building, it's like I rename everything as it grows, depending on where they sit. But I tend to do the other way around. So everything is named as a global class. For example, like if we're talking about layouts, grids are a big one. So everything would start with just like grid and then the number of columns, for example. But then the problem, it comes when it goes to smaller screen sizes and then different layouts behave in different ways. And then at that point, I would say, oh, this one behaves differently from all the other ones. And therefore, I'll give it a custom just for this section class. So it's looking at, I guess, from the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Major plus one. I think y'all both nailed it. Like, it's never perfect from the start. We take a good stab at it, and then exactly like they were both describing, you can always iterate later. Like what makes me think of is, I feel like university videos say this a lot. Like, we're gonna give this thing a name, but we can always change it later, right? And I think I've seen this again out in the development ethos as well, that like class naming specifically, like some people feel like that's the downfall of CSS, is that you have to name classes. And like I see that perspective, but I think that's part of the whole strategy, right? And knowing that, especially with Webflow, it is pretty easy to update those things later. You don't have to like dig through multiple HTML files like you used to to update things. Like you can just go find the class and update it. And I think one other quick thing I wanted to mention based on like just the previous note around Raymar, you mentioned folders and the Finsweet extension. I think like that's a shining example too, where like these frameworks also don't need to be absolute. You can intermix things from them. Like an example is Mast. The naming is pretty much identical to Finsweet, which is very much an iteration of BEM that, you know, came far before Webflow. And so it's like those things can all work together, right? Like, so you can use folders with Mast or whatever, and, you know, vice versa, right? You could use Reloom components that follow client first and pull them in and then update them to Knockout probably, or something like that. It's going to take a little doing, but it would still be a step to help and save time, right? So
yeah,
it's all a process.
Yeah, it just occurred to me when you were talking, I'm wondering who's building the ChatGPT plugin to auto name CSS for you. So you don't have to like, it's just in your dev environment and it's just gonna like come up with semantic names for you and suggest them all the way. I wanted to talk a little bit about just some of the, you know, to give Finsweet the due, the Chrome extension and the little candies and things in there for, you know, renaming the styles at scale. The folders is a great way to visualize classes. You know, so whether you're using client first in its entirety or not, there are a lot of tools to learn. And I think this is where it becomes like an endless dive. Hopefully, if you've been watching this up to this point, you know, we've had an interesting conversation back and forth on like what these frameworks are, why you would use them, how you approach them, kind of how to make it your own. But there's so much more complexity here. Like we could probably go on for multiple hours talking about things like rems versus ems versus pixels. And we could get into like basic typography settings, and we could talk about fluid responsiveness, and we could talk about accessibility. And we, you know, there's so many other layers that kind of come into this whole process of building inside of this. And I think that's where, you know, a lot of people that come into Webflow maybe don't understand, you know, what they're getting into, that they are getting, you know, full access to the complexity of front-end code, just with a visual interface on it. And so I think we'll leave it at that, just from a conversational standpoint. There were some questions here, so maybe we'll just actually bring a couple of these questions in. Where was it? Nicola Toledo was saying, I would like to know the differences between, is it client? I'm not sure what, something's clicking wrong here. These stupid comments, I swear. Okay, I would like to know what are the differences with client first and why they don't use it. So I don't know, to the other ones that maybe don't use the client first or came up with a different little iteration, can you maybe share a little bit about like what the core difference was for you? Or was there something specifically? Was it the spacing system? Was it the utility classes? Like what? And I'll give both Alessia and Corey a chance to answer this one.
Yeah, I can go first.
Sure.
Again, I think there's parts of client first that I just love, especially like candidly, the first version of the docs was so good around naming and some of those things, like you know, not overusing utilities, not combining utilities and combos, etc. And so I think the main things for me that stood out is one, no layout system. And that was an active choice. That is a totally fair reason why they didn't use a layout system. But for me, especially coming from kind of front-end development pre-Webflow and used to like Bootstrap column system, which is essentially what's in Mast, I'm a big fan of like that concept of being able to build, you know, the way I've been putting it is like about 80% of your layouts can be done with just those 66 classes in the column system in Mast. And then you're always going to have that other 20% that's fully custom because of whatever unique circumstances you're trying to lay out. And then the point being that you can scale to, you know, what Mason said earlier, thousands of pages, and you still only use those 66 classes versus every single element needing a new custom class and reference. So that'd be one. And then I think the other one is even just, yeah, back to what I said earlier, less is more, I guess, in my mindset. And so even things like sections and containers, I'm just used to the concept, again, of just one div with a class of section and one div within it as a child with a class of container and some combo classes if needing to adjust those versus kind of the like 4-layer deep approach with client first. And that is very much in the same realm of even like all of the spacing and margin and padding utilities. Is you'll notice that Mass doesn't actually have any mobile variants, or doesn't have many mobile variants of spacing utilities, because I've just found that if you use M's and things to their leveraged abilities, then you actually don't need them. But of course, you can always add them. And so again, I think that's for me the main differences, is just trying to like consolidate down to as few things as possible, and then things like the layout system is like maximizing reusability as much as I'm able to. So
yeah, I think that was some of the big stuff for me too, was the like sections dash, you know, whatever section it is versus just one section. And then the nesting for the spacing. Like that was always just kind of, you know, even now when you go in and you see the like the 3 layers nested divs and stuff, like I get it and I understand it, but it wasn't, I don't know. So Alessia, what are your takeaways? I mean, were those some of the same things Corey mentioned? Did you have different thoughts as far as differences to client first?
I think is pretty much the same. So the structure, I get why they did it the way that they do, because then it could apply to any website. But we found that in most cases we didn't need as many divs nested one inside the other. Like not everyone needs the global page wrapper, for example, or a lot of nested divs. So we took away a lot of those, which doesn't mean that you can't use client first. You can still the same process, just taking out a few divs in the process. I think padding as well, or like spacing. Well, I believe that you change it from V1 to V2. So now it's in between rather than wrapping it around it. But again, I don't know, I find it much easier to use the flex gap or grid gap to define those spacing in between the items. So otherwise, everything that Corey said as well.
Nice. Okay, yeah, that so hopefully Nicola, that answers your question there. I'm sure again we could go back. Harshit, do you want to say any thoughts on that? You want to defend the client first?
No, I think that's the beauty of client first. You know, you can you can have your own system. Like if you don't want page wrapper, you can completely skip that part, right? And then talking about the sections and all, we actually made that decision, with section name, so that it's easier in the navigator where when we see the section name, so it's easier for the client, easier for the developers. But a lot of people will not like to have section with their names, just to reduce the structure, which is completely fine. So I think client first is having those guidelines and all. We call it a strategy, right? We don't call them solid rules. When it comes to spacing as well, there is a spacing block strategy where you can have empty blocks, which I personally don't use. Then there is margin top, margin bottom strategy. You can have your own strategy like flex gaps, right? So we would like to call them as strategies, because again, we are not trying to force anyone here with the systems and with the style systems, and none of the systems try to force you, right? So with the client first as well, I think the flexibility is with you, and you have to make a educated decision there, what you really want to do with the system. yeah
Yeah.
that is what I would say about this.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. And I think regardless, go like all the links to all these systems are in the description of this video. Go look at them and explore them and look at the nuances yourself, right? Read the documentation. I think one of the hardest things about these systems is not creating the systems. We all have a system, how we build in Webflow, and some like decision tree for how we like decide, okay, what is this going to be? What, like the hard part is the documentation and the consistency between the builds, right? And so I think one of the things that all of these systems have done really well is create documentation that allows you to go in and really read from the perspective. I mean, if we look at the documentations for Knockout, client first, the flow class, the mass documentation, like there's just so much to read and to learn. So whether you're using this as like a newbie, or whether you're, coming into this and just trying to optimize the way you build, take a look at all of them. You know, take a look at these things. Like anytime somebody comes out and they're like, I have the new framework and this is the perfect way to build in Webflow. I'm like, okay, let's go see. And I go and I clone it and I look at it and I check the guts of it. And I really think that, you know, I know some of the mechanics of how the like Webflow Showcase has changed a little bit, but that's still one of the top resources for you as a Webflow developer. Just go in and start looking at these projects, like open them in Webflow, look at the guts, even if it's not like, you know, a framework you're looking to study. Maybe you want to know how somebody built a certain component. You know, like learning how to debug in Webflow is just as important as learning how to build, because if you get in and somebody else did something and you're like, how do they do this? You know, learning how to backtrack through the classes and understand how each one's affecting and troubleshoot where are the things that are happening wrong on this page happening. Those are all important things about becoming a really top quality Webflow dev. And I would encourage you, if you're watching this, to just go explore all this. Like, you kind of constantly have to be looking and learning and thinking about, you know, what's Timothy Ricks doing with his wizardry stuff, right? What's Client First doing with responsiveness? Who's the next person that's innovating on some template? Reloom, their little class deduplication extension is such an amazing thing. Being able to copy, like, I know they intended it to be able to drop Reloom components in, but just copying and pasting from one project to the other and having those classes just sync, that's such a time saver. And you don't learn these things unless you're digging in the space, right? Unless you're watching an 1.5 hour long live stream, you know, deep into the weeds, right? So that's all I can say. We'll do one final round the table. We'll start with Alessia at the top left corner here. Any final thoughts, closing thoughts, words of inspiration for people watching?
Ooh, I think keep
spot.
exploring.
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep digging, keep trying new things. Like I said, try to get out of the Webflow bubble, because I think the more things that we can take in from existing tools and ways of doing things, the more we can expand the bubble itself. So yeah.
Nice. We'll take the Aiva. You got some thoughts for us? You've been sitting back there quietly. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the client listening to this, you know, based on what I do in Webflow, you guys are way deep into that. And I love that. Like, you know, just like being a client in the background and, oh, you know, I'm somewhat of a designer myself here. But yeah, I would say for those who listen for an hour, now is the time to remind that it's never finished. It's just a dabble in and learning and trying out new things. And sometimes you don't need to do things right, just have to do them fast. And sometimes you have to do them right. And then sometimes you have to just test it out. So, you know, I have a build now that I'm working. It's a template on Webflow, and I'm using Client First on top of that template collection. So it's a nightmare. And I know that it's a nightmare, but we have to push it out fast and have it done. And then V2 will be an actual planned version. Yeah. So sometimes it's not the way, sometimes it's the way. Just know when to do what and trust your gut feeling and go with it. And right, that's, I think, the message here.
To go counter to the name of the episode, done is better than perfect every time. You know?
Yeah, and websites are never done, so just go with it.
That's right. All right, Harshit, final thoughts, inspiration for the crowd.
I think my final thoughts would be about two things. I think about systems. Whenever you are using a system, I think it's very important for you to have a process around it. Okay, don't only focus on certain things, like, or you are focusing on only naming the classes, right? You have to make sure that you are focusing on a proper HTML semantic structure as well. You are focusing on interaction naming. You are having a process for component naming, right? So make sure that you are covering all those things. Then only you have a system which really works, and that takes you closer to that perfect build, you know, we are talking about. So it's kind of a recipe for a perfect build, where it's not only about CSS naming, it's also about interaction naming. It's also about accessibility, following certain processes. When you are making website, you are making sure you have alt text on all of the images. So you are following a process, and that this process path is going to take you closer to the perfect build. And at last, I would also say that don't bound yourself to a system. So if you are using a Client First, if you are using Must, make sure you are not putting a lot of load on your head that I have to stick to the rules. That is very unhealthy, I think. You will feel annoyed, and you will not it's not healthy for you. So don't stick yourselves to the rules. See what's good for you, what's good for your client, and make an informed decision. I think that is going to give you ultimately a good website and take you closer to your goal.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well said. Corey, final thoughts?
So good. I'm gonna tail off Harshit's end there. So good. I think I remember when it originally like come across Webflow, the company I worked at, one of the mindsets we had on as like we started using it on client work is like, let's use it till we can break, or till it breaks, or till we can't use it anymore. And so similar to Harshit's note there, it's like, just even with frameworks, have that mindset, like push it to the point where like you feel like it's failing, and then question why, and maybe ways that you can improve it, or have a system that works within that edge case. Yeah, and then +1 also to Alessia's comment, just like keep looking and pull inspiration from outside of the Webflow community and bring it back in, and just like get over that hump of that I fully empathize with, of the struggle with sharing. And, like we're all learning. And I think something so incredible that, I'm preaching to the choir kind of thing is just this community is so open to those ideas and explorations and divergence and strategies. So like, bring it up, let's share, let's talk about it. Let's all find a way to like build things better that ultimately like lifts the whole community. Right. And yeah, it sets us all out better. So thank you so much for having me.
Agree. I love all of it. Colleen, any thoughts here as we close?
Yeah, I'm so glad that we've got multiple people that are creating frameworks and strategies on this type of thing. I mean, one of the things that came up several times today was about like cognitive load. And I know when I was just starting with using Webflow, the blank page was just very intimidating, and frameworks like Client First wasn't out, Mast wasn't out, Flow Class wasn't out, the types of things that Reloom is doing, those things just didn't exist. And so on top of learning Webflow, it was then going in and trying to figure out, what do I name things? How do I do things? And it was a lot. And so now being able to have these frameworks that you can go and pick and choose depending upon the project, depending upon how you build your client, what you're thinking about, it's really nice to have these options. And it's also nice to have these options in terms of not just what you're doing and going in and building, but advancing your own skill set. So being able to go into the Made in Webflow showcase and being able to open up somebody else's project and see, how is it that they've done this? I want to know how to do this. And you're not spending quite so much time trying to figure it out. I mean, yes, you do need to spend some time, but now you're not necessarily doing so much with the classes because it's maybe noticeable. Yes, they're using Client First, or they're using Mast, or they're using Knockout, or they're using Hatch, or they're using something. So all as part of speeding up visual development and becoming better developers and experimenting. So thanks everyone for continuing to build and create, because I certainly benefit from it. So thank you.
Well said. I have a couple closing thoughts that kind of follow up on everything that's just been said. And I think, we talk about not calling Webflow easy, but I also think that Webflow will never be easier to use. And I say that because Webflow is infinitely increasing its complexity. So think about learning Webflow 5 years ago versus learning Webflow today, right? There was so much less you could do from an interaction standpoint, from an integration standpoint, from the symbols and components were not what they are now. And think about the complexity that's adding. Think about logic that's coming. Think about e-commerce that's coming. Think about all these different frameworks that's coming. What happens if they open up plugins and the back end fully gets opened up? And so this is one of the things where like, yeah, Webflow's not easy, but it's never going to get easier either, And so like we have such an advantage that we've kind of been learning over this evolution, and we've kind of been getting to piecemeal it. But think about coming into this space right now. Like if you're approaching this and you're like learning and seeing all this stuff, you're like, oh my goodness. So don't be discouraged. Just start. Like Harshit said, like Corey said, like everyone's kind of said on the just start shipping stuff, start playing with stuff, start getting into the clonable showcase, start making things, get on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter as a Webflow dev, I think that's where the core of the community lives. And I really just encourage you to think about how you can just take small chunks. If you start thinking about like, I have to learn all this at once, it becomes almost insurmountable. The complexity is too much, but just a little thing. Okay, can you build one card? Can you dissect a reloom component? Can you take a clonable and add a page to it yourself? And as you slowly start doing this, can you take a design that's one thing and make it something else without clearing all the styles or without starting new, by just adapting and looking back? And these are the ways you learn, right? So this is a tinkerer's world. The world of, you know, the web is all about building and tinkering and experimenting. And I would say that Webflow is the perfect place to experiment with that, especially if you've got a creative flair or want to put information or ideas onto the internet. So those are my closing thoughts. Thanks everyone who's been watching up to this point and who has hung out with us so far. Be sure to like the video. We've got, what, 248 views that will have come through, and there's only 29 likes. So there's 34 of you watching now. At least every one of you should like it. We can get to 34 by the end of the show. We'd appreciate that. We'll be here every Tuesday live, and we're experimenting with some other stuff kind of behind the scenes, maybe get hands-on, workshop, teaching, things like that. So anyway, that's all I got. Anybody else? Closing thoughts? Otherwise, I'm going to hit this little background music. Let's get this slowly popping. Yeah. Right on. That's it.
Yeah, and check out the Minneapolis meetup. Corey's going to be there tonight talking more about Mast.
Oh, that's right. And
yes.
With that being said, let's close out with a couple things. Be sure to check out the stateofflow.io. Subscribe on that. If you're not getting our emails before these streams, we've got a bunch of stuff coming. We've got tools that we're going to launch. We've got collaborations that we're working on with other folks in the community. This State of Flow page is going to become a multimedia hub for lots of different things that are happening in the community. So May 16th, we're going to make some major announcements at the open house with what we've kind of got going, and what we're building for the future. Don't think we're going to sleep here on the community stuff. Just like people are iterating with what you build, we're going to be iterating with what you can build with people working together. And that's kind of the core of what Colleen and I like to do with all this State of Flow stuff. So anyway, you can expect that we'll be doing much more of that as we move forward. And there was one other thing, Colleen, but I don't remember, and we're just going to fade to black and send it. So catch you next week. Bye, everyone.